Synesthesia in the music of Olivier Messiaen.
Good morning. The aim of this article is to recognize part of the compositional technique of Messiaen through the audiation of sound and color. Messiaen, through his development of the modes of limited transposition and their direct relations to various colors, paints sonic landscapes. Messiaen, being a fine improviser on the organ, used the instrument and the room at Sainte Trinité to realize his audiations. These improvisations became a release of sonic material that was based in his head. Understanding their cerebral processes of improvisation and synesthesia can add a positive dimension to music and a general appreciation of the compositional method. Synesthesia, in and of itself, is a complex trait that is not fully understood. There's a brief attempt in this particular paper to clarify the cognitive process of improvisation and synesthesia as a trait that some individuals possess. Edwin Gordon developed a musical learning theory in 1975 that is based on audiation, where individuals see, hear, and imagine music inside their head. The exercises to sharpen musical performance and composition were designed for students in elementary music education. Audiation certainly existed prior to this date as a practice for musicians and non-musicians, but it is not formalized until this time. And I would quote Gordon from his work. Audiation is the process of assimilating and comprehending, not simply rehearsing and rehearing music momentarily heard, performed, or heard sometime in the past. We also audiate when we assimilate and comprehend in our minds music we may or may not have heard, but are reading in notation or composing or improvising. This process of, end quote, this process of hearing music in our heads is a common practice when remembering a melody or musical texture or when a musical squib comes to mind. This concept of adapting or integrating a heard melody in the process is of audiation. Another very important part of audiation is understanding and realizing the music, the actual comprehension of music. This analytical quality and inspiration are the roots of composition. As in language, one function of musical expression is to communicate. The auditory process and the cognition of that process is aligned with musical perception and cognition. Again, Gordon states, and I quote him, "We audiate when listening to, recalling, performing, interpreting, creating, improvising, writing, or reading music." Consider language and thought. Language is the result of a need to communicate. Thought is what we communicate. Music performance and audiation have parallel meanings. Music is the subject of communication. Performance is the vehicle for communication. And audiation is what is communicated, end quote. Improvisation is included in Gordon's list of what is audiated. It is curious that improvisation, which is usually an external phenomena, is part of an auditory process, which is internal. Indeed, Baldwin suggests, and I quote Baldwin, auditory processing requires the interaction of hearing, a sensory process, an interpretation of the acoustical signal, a perceptual cognitive process, end quote. Therein lies the foundation of improvisation as an audiated process and its facility to composition. The American experimental composer and philosopher John Cage once said that he did not believe that improvisation was a technique for composing. Cage's theory was based on the notion that improvisational material only comes from what the improviser already knows. However, the compositions of Messiaen, profoundly influenced by improvisation that Messiaen did on the organ using specific pitches, rhythmic elements, and various colors or timbres, were the result of his improvisations that explored novel territories. improvisation has played a significant role in Messiaen's musical life, influencing his approach to composition. Indeed, many of his organ works began as extemporizations. His opportunities to improvise at La Trinité provided Messiaen with a compositional laboratory where he could experiment with rhythm, harmony, and melody. In this compositional laboratory, Messiaen was able to realize the previous audiations of melody and harmony he presented in his organ works. But most significantly, for me, Messiaen's fixation with time and eternity was realized in improvisations on the organ with its ability to sustain sound indefinitely. Thus, the improvisations on the organ allowed Messiaen to audiate in the world of time and eternity. And I quote from Bennett's: "As an improviser, Messiaen recognized that the organ's seemingly power to sustain sound endlessly allowed him to explore relations between time and eternity by experimenting with duration," end quote. This fascination with time led to the development of thematic material within an improvisation, allowing Messiaen to realize and audiate the idea of eternity. As aptly presented in the work of Jackson, musicians who improvise categorize musical structures by developing their functional significance rather than focusing on the localized chord-to-chord progressions, and I quote Jackson: "The improvising musician will see and realize many different representations of musical structure, including notation, with chord symbols that indicate the collection of notes to be played," end quote. Jackson goes on in his discussion about regarding musicians as improvisers, and I quote again, "have a stronger response to stimuli that is functional deviant compared to those with an exemplar deviant, as the functional deviant contains novel information rather than reconfigured information. Results from the behavioral data show that improvisation experience significantly correlated with quicker and more accurate responses to functional deviance," end quote. This composition, one of the prospects of network with sections of the brain involved in perception regulation, such as anterior cingulate cortex and the medial prefrontal cortex, which are linked to conscious judgment of stimuli, interior incentive and recompense, and also conflict checking. These positions are specifically situated in intangible neural activities. Expanding the area to embrace visual stimulus as such of Messiaen's music does, relates to color, and those cognition zones are correspondently locatable. And I would quote Caleb from his work: "Functional magnetic resonant imaging, or fMRI, activation associated with visual motion perception task was used to characterize local changes in brain activity at baseline and after training," end quote. Now a brief discussion of neurologically synesthesia and cognition. Synesthesia is a perpetual phenomenon in which stimulation of one sensory or cognitive pathway leads to automatic involuntary experiences in a second sensory or cognitive pathway. Synesthesia is the creation of a sensation that is associated with one bodily sense by stimulation of an alternative sense or part of the body. Chromesthesia, sound to color synesthesia, is experienced by Oliver Messiaen and Chirliones, as by many other musician artists such as Vincent van Gogh, Alexandra Scriabin, Billy Joel, Tori Amos, Duke Ellington, and Franz Liszt. In fact, 4% of the population experiences some form of synesthesia. In short, synesthesia is a joining of sensation. Having one type of synesthesia, like color sound, increases the chance of having a second, third, or fourth type. It is a trait, not a disorder. A hyperconnection of brain neurons is what is involved in synesthesia. Cognition, on the other hand, can be understood as moments of ordered configurations of small links of neurons, and less emerging purposes can be understood as consequences of the hierarchical arrangements of those small networks, according to Cook. And I quote Cook: three behaviors most clearly distinguish human beings from other animals, species: language, tool use, and music. Are all three involved in functional asymmetry of the cerebral hemispheres? Both left and right hemispheres demonstrate diverse areas and are activated by language and musical condition. Currently, functional asymmetry is vital for an understanding of the human condition. The supreme complexity of the human mind, to which artificial intelligence is often compared, far outweighs existing artificial intelligence systems. And again, from Cook. As complex as the neurophysiological of information processing in multi-million neuronal networks may actually be, cognition is often considered among the so-called easy problems of the human mind, for the simple reason that basic logical functions and memory mechanisms are theoretically well understood and can be implemented in computers using simulated neurons. Even the largest, most complex, and most expensive artificial systems do not rival the functions of a primitive living brains, so that no practitioner of AI would claim that anything approaching the full complexity of an ant, much less a human, cognition has been implemented as to date. End quotation. It is curious that both Messiaen and Cherliones had this trait of synesthesia. Cherliones, also a painter, clearly brought his painting and imagery into his music. Messiaen appreciated painting, but he was taken by the colors that were formed by the sun shining through stained glass windows. According to Saitowik, synesthesia represents a fundamental quality of sensation. Early development of children can teach us much about sensation and how crosstalk within the brain results in a synesthetic experience. Research suggests all neonates are synthetic, only to lose the trait around the age of about 3 months. One possibility for why the crosstalk that produces synesthesia exists is that the normally occurring excess connections are insufficiently pruned for some reason, accordingly, and persist in an adult. Like a metaphor in which seemingly unrelated things have the ability to link other unrelated things, seeing the similar in the dissimilar, sensory coupling or crosstalk exists in all brains, except most of us are unaware of it. An altered dynamic between excitation and inhibition brings that crosstalk to the surface in synesthetes. Metaphors often take the form of crosstalk association. Yet non-synesthetes understand sharp cheese or sweet person or what's your taste in music. Movies persuade us to believe that people on the screen are talking when really one speaker behind the middle of the screen, 3 speakers on either side, and a subwoofer create the impression that speech comes from those on the screen. Inwardly, we are all synesthetes, but outwardly, we are unaware of the couplings that are happening all the time. In 1986, Claude Samuel spent a significant time questioning and talking with Messiaen. During these conversations, Messiaen spoke freely about his synesthesia, and I quote Messiaen, "I am all the same affected by a sort of synesthesia, more in my mind than in my body, that allows me, when I hear music and also when I read it, to see inwardly, in the mind's eye, colors that move with the music, and I vividly sense these colors, and sometimes I've precisely indicated their correspondence in my scores." Messiaen was actually aware of the audiation that he underwent in his compositional process. He stated, "When I hear a score or read it, hearing it in my mind, I visualize corresponding colors which in turn shift and combine, just as the sounds turn, shift, and combine simultaneously." Here Messiaen clearly discusses audiation and its relation to synesthesia. These visualized colors correspond to harmonies. Truthfully, and this is again Messiaen, truthfully, one cannot talk of an exact correspondence between a key and a color that would be a rather naive way of expressing oneself because, as I've said, colors are complex and are linked to equally complex chords and sonorities, close quotes. The complex chords devised by Messiaen come from his musical language, which is rather strict in its choices made in composition. For Lerdahl, music grammar consists of two components, compositional grammar and listening grammar. Regarding improvisation, a natural compositional grammar depends on the listening grammar of a source. Otherwise, the various musical functions would not evolve in such a spontaneous and unified fashion. The relationship between improvisation and composition is complex, to say the least. Jackson articulately presents in his studies on improvisation, and I quote Jackson, "As music improvisation is a practice that requires a practitioner to negotiate a number of harmonic subspaces as they are pressed against the precipice of time, experimenters have added challenge of coming up with questions that speak to the neural responses to the act of improvising in an expert musician and non-musician groups, and the neurostructural responses of improvisers in improvisatory and non-improvisatory sections." That was a mouthful. Close quote. La Trinité was a workshop of sonic ideas where Messiaen improvisations later were controlled and disciplined by his self-imposed methodology employed in his compositional system. While discussing his modes of limited transposition, Messiaen said, and I quote Messiaen again, "Mode 2 revolves around certain violets, blues, violet purple, while mode 3, in its first transposition, corresponds to an orange with red and green pigments, with specks of gold, and also a milky white with iridescent opaline reflections." Close quote. These undulating colors that are present in Messiaen's modes of limited transposition become the framework for his melodic development. With the melodic development seen by Messiaen as a supreme aspect of music, supported by continuous shifting of colors formed by his harmonies, he paints a masterpiece of colorful music. And finally, in conclusion, audiation and its relationship to improvisation, composition, and synesthesia is presented in the research of Cractus. According to Cractus, and I quote him, "I view compositional products as fixed, replicable sequences of pitches and durations of compositional process, as the fluid thoughts and actions of a composer in generating the product," close quote. When Messiaen heard music in his head or went to the organ to improvise with melodic and harmonic colors, these three elements were the building blocks of his organ compositions. The study of cognition as it relates to synesthesia and improvisation in many ways is still in its infancy. The complexity of the neural networks and the cross-wiring that facilitates synesthesia, along with the use of improvisation to test or examine sonic possibilities, is but one possible approach to composition. Understanding the organ music of Messiaen can lead to a deeper understanding of improvisation, synesthesia, and audiation. Thank you.
Questions? Still have some time.
Thank you. Fascinating. Two unrelated questions. Messiaen's improvisation was, this is in a liturgical context, in church, during the Mass and so forth, as an organist would be expected to improvise. Is that mostly what his improvisation was? Improvisation?
Partly. And then in my research, I found a whole group of improvisations on the Gregorian Champur, Nautus Est, where he would improvise and talk about the improvisation before he played. So they were it wasn't really a concert situation. I think it was more of a recording situation. They were outside the liturgical practice. But you're right. I think in most of it was done within a liturgy.
And I guess an unrelated question, was Messiaen's synesthesia involuntary, or do you think in most cases that this is something one engages willingly, or does the color purple come to mind involuntarily?
My limited understanding of it, because I don't share that, I have a different kind of thing going on in my head when I improvise, is that it's involuntary. It happens. I don't think it's something conscious, is my understanding.
Right. Because in that quotation from Messiaen, he wasn't addressing that. He talked about it's happening, but I didn't see evidence of whether he would engage it or whether it would happen.
When you read about his early development, it wasn't until he was a prisoner of war and was outside the camp in Poland very late in the evening. He looked up at the sky and saw for the first time the aurora borealis. And he said, that's what I hear and that's what I see when I play my music. That kind of undulating of color. So that was really, I think, the first time that he said he was able to make that connection. Because I think many times it happens to people and they don't know what's going on.
I also have some unrelated, or maybe related observation that when we talk about sound quality, about timbre, about we use the word color. And what is this color? It is mostly attributable to timbre and it's essentially spectrum. And what is color in painting or in general in visual arts? It's also spectrum. We have this kind of unconscious link between these two phenomena. And we kind of have this synesthesia, unconscious synesthesia, that may be a material for future research.
I sure hope so. I mean, I hope that someone, I've always been fascinated by, for example, the presentation that you did, Tatiana, these natural things that happen that we as human beings ascribe meaning to or talk about in a mathematical sense. The overtone series being another one of those. How we play with those, not having a clue what we're doing, but we're just doing it. And this maybe is a perfect segue into the carillon across the street. When you tune a bell, it is a very complex thing that's going on because you hear the hum tone, the fundamental, and you hear the octaves, and you hear all these different harmonics, and you have to tune those to kind of make a perfect bell sound. How much do we do in our tuning of our lives as composers to make the perfect piece or a piece of music?
The other aspect is the inharmonic aspect.
I'm sorry, I didn't
The
hear.
other aspect of tuning the bell is the inharmonicity of the sound of the bell and of our lives. Yep.
Tuning is a relatively new thing in the world of bells.
You said something very different goes on in your head when you improvise. I'm wondering what it is.
It's what I asked you the first day. What do you see? I see things. I've improvised all my life, and I've come to realize two things: that when I improvise, when I play music, I see images. And I'm not sure I can say much more except that.
Is that a kind of synesthesia?
Perhaps. Perhaps it
I had a
is.
similar thing about image and music, which I was saying as well.
The other thing is that years ago, I was in the blower room of an organ, standing at the top step of a 16-foot ladder where it says, "Don't step on this step." And I was cleaning off cobwebs off the ceiling with a broom, and I fell. And as I was falling, it was one of those falls that lasted 20 minutes. It was really a second. But when I hit the ground, I realized this is going to be bad. And I broke both calculus on my feet at the same time. So I was in casts for months. And I think there was more psychological damage that was done than physical damage. Anyway, that's all to say that when I was playing at this church, when I went up to play the weekend services, kind of hobbled up the stairs and put this one leg in a cast on one corner and on the other, and played the organ, it was the only time that I was pain-free. So those two things I've come to realize in music, that they take me out of my body when it comes to pain, and take me out of my body sounds too weird, but it's that when I see images and see things.
I was going to add something else, but this really made me think of shamanistic ritual, which shaman leaves his physical body, and it cannot be accomplished without the agency of music. And then it goes back to the concept of transitional objects, as Donald Winnicott postulated some 50 years ago, about music being something which is both part of us and part of the outside world. So it's actually been described for decades and been known somehow for thousands of years. Shamanism goes back. But what I was going to ask, has anybody tried to investigate this considerable differences, the way that, let's say, Scriabin or Rimsky-Korsakov or synesthesia, where they identify precise colors of certain keys, and Messiaen-like synesthesia, which is something rather different, and then some other, Ligeti, for instance, who may have been synesthetic as well, is very difficult to describe in what ways, but somehow he had some vision. So has anyone really got into it?
There's been quite a bit of research done on synesthesia. But I would caution us to go back to the original definition of what it is. It's a crosstalk of neurons that are happening at the same time. So one very small part of synesthesia is this sound color, chromesthesia. There are others, for example, Tuesday is bitter, or people's names. Roger is prickly, and I would remember his name and him as a person by the sensation or the visualization of prickliness. So it's really many different things, and I think that composing and music is one way that we just dabble in it, and reaching for something that I'm not sure we even know what we're reaching for, but we try and we continue doing it. And if I could also put in a plug for this particular conference, it's the beauty of this, that you take the time and give the importance to what you do and talk about it. It's just wonderful. Did I say anything that was connected to what you were saying?
Okay, so thank you very much.
Thank you. I have been asked to invite you all to this 2 o'clock Carillon concert that is just across the street. One of the pieces I'm going to be playing is a piece by John Cage. It's called Music for Carillon No. 5. And I just wanted to say a little bit. Do I have time? Okay, quick. That the score is 5 plates of sheets of plywood. And he drew these lines on them, just black lines, I guess, to like the lines of a stave. And my directions are to interpret the grain of wood on each of these pieces of plywood. So there are 10 of them. He did the photographed front to back. And I have the score if anyone's interested in seeing the score. It's quite an interesting piece. So I hope you enjoy it. But before I play each one of those plates, I'll go bong for 1 or bong bong for 2 just before I play each plate. So you'll hear these strikes on the bell and then I'll do something. Thank you again.
Do you play them in order?
I do play them in order.
So it will go 1, 2, 3, 4.
Yeah. And as I showed you, I'm not sure if this or, if it should be this way or if it should be this way. So I'm just, choosing